relates to our faith in a couple of ways. So first, I'm calling them professional disclaimers, but that's like a bigger thing than it is. Just letting you know I have my PhD in biochemistry, received it in 2025 as my graduation picture with my advisor. I am not a theologian. That is not what my formal education is in. So I'm going to be talking about like my personal reflections on the faith as a scientist. But my word is not gospel and it is not law on things that do not pertain to my particular discipline. I'm also an employee at St. Jude, but all opinions are my own, etc., etc. So we're split into 3 sections today. So first we're going to talk about creation, and then we're going to look at the fall, and then we're going to end with looking at Christ's redeeming mission. And in each section, I'm kind of taking out some salient scriptures to give us kind of a theological background on these different areas, and then I'm going to talk about how science reflects some of these realities. So starting with creation, so at the very beginning of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says the earth was without form or shape. And so we can kind of think about the way that God created it as kind of 2 things. So it's something being without form, so it's very chaotic. It's not ordered, right? And it's also without shape. And it's also empty. The darkness overcame this. There's like nothing, there's nothing there. So we could think about creation happening in 2 steps. So the first step is that God orders creation, creates order from chaos. So he separates the light from the darkness, separates the sky from the oceans. So first he orders creation, and then he fills creation. So these are kind of the 2 basic steps we're looking at. So the earth brings forth vegetation, God makes every kind of animal. So he orders the chaos, and then he fills it. And then we have a lot more to look at for the creation of man specifically. So as we all know, God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. So we know we're made in the image of God. We know that we were made with detail and attention and precision. As it says in Psalm 139, before my inmost being, you knit me in my mother's womb. I was made in secret, fashioned in the depths of the earth, right? So I imagine like God is like, looking through, if you've ever the watchmaker analogy is not a great one, but you can imagine like, he's just like looking really closely, looking at every smallest detail. Is kind of what this is about. And we know that we were made with a particular sense of value to God. Because the Lord says, you are worth more than many sparrows, and even the hairs of your head have all been counted. So we can know that we were made with a particular attention and particular care. And we know that we were made with a purpose. So again, God tells us in the beginning, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish and the sea, birds of the air. And he also said, before I formed you in the womb, I dedicated you, a prophet to the nations I appointed you. So we were created with a purpose. And so again, kind of the major themes that we're looking at with creation is ordering chaos, creating abundance from emptiness, having detail, design, attention, and being created with purpose. Okay, and so what does that look like as a biologist? So my PhD is in biochemistry, so we're going to mostly look at the small stuff today. But we can even look at just as a human being, the levels of organization that we have. So starting with like our organ system, so think about your digestive system, which is made of a whole bunch of different organs that have to work in concert to help you digest your food and get nutrients to the rest of your body. We can then dissect that down into individual organs that perform individual functions. We can dissect that down into tissues within specific organs that are they all look different and do different things. And then you can look at the individual cells and the individual tissues and the individual organs. So we're getting smaller and smaller, and we have order, and then even inside your cells, you have organized compartments called organelles that perform different functions inside of your cell. And then we can look at the arrangement of macromolecules to molecules to all the way down to atoms. So in my world, atoms are like the smallest thing that make up us. Father Nicholas would disagree with me, but we can quibble about quarks another time. I thought of that one specifically for you, Father Nicholas.
Thank you.
Okay. And so in biology, again, the world that I live in the world of cells and smaller, so that's where we're going to live for this talk. We have what we call the central dogma, which if you ever took a high school biology class, you've kind of seen this before. I think we're all familiar with the DNA. This is basically the instructions that are stored inside all of your cells that tell your cells how to make you. So this is like the permanent blueprint of like how to make oxy inside your cells. And then the way your body uses that blueprint is it transcribes it into something called mRNA. So RNA is basically just you're extracting the bit of the information that you need to do something. And then that's translated into the code of proteins. And proteins are the molecules in your bodies that do the actual things inside your body. And proteins, these are all what we would call macromolecules. And all that really means is that they're a string of individual things that make up one big thing. So you can think of like beads on a string or something like that. And even with proteins, so these are all created with a particular form. They're not just like amorphous blobs. So these have a certain ordered structure. So you start with primary structure, which is again that beads on a string that I just discussed. And then that is structured into varying levels of complexity. Again, there's not a test, so don't worry about like remembering what any of these things. I'm just giving you concepts. So we have secondary structure, which you can think of as like Lego bricks that are then assembled together to make what the whole protein looks like, which is what we call tertiary structure. And then you can sometimes have what's called quaternary structure, which is where you build two Lego structures and they fit together to do something. That's quaternary structure. And all proteins don't look the same. So this is just an assembly of a bunch of random protein structures that have been discovered by scientists over the years. So we have things like this is a virus here. This is a channel of some kind. This is part of what's called the cytoskeleton. So there's this big skeleton in your cells that helps give it structure and shape because your cell is basically just a giant water balloon. So you have these little support structures that help keep everything rigid. We have, this looks like an ATP synthase here. Again, you don't have to know what all these are, but you can tell that like everything has a different structure, and that's designed for a different function, right? So there's so much detail that goes into even the little smallest bits that make up us. And all of these proteins are designed to work together as a big assembly. So again, we have our cytoskeleton here, that big spider web that connects your cell and gives it structure. And that's a molecule called dynein. It's moving a vesicle around somewhere in your cell. So again, we can watch it kind of step here. These are not like literal videos. These are artistic representations, but they're based off of like the real scientific principles of like this protein here does actually step. That's something that we've figured out over the years, is that it takes little steps across this track and carries these vesicles around to like where they need to go. It's super, super cool. And then walk in. It's so cool. And then they also can form larger machines. So this is a protein called ATP synthase. It's in the mitochondria powerhouse of the cell, right? So this is like the generator that makes the ATP. And ATP is like your energy storage molecule. So you can see that they literally, they turn, they have cogs, right? So it's a literal machine inside of your body that makes stuff. I'm going to take questions at the end, Chad, so just hold on to that. It's the lawyer in me.
Yeah.
And so this is all beautiful and elegant and oh, isn't that so pretty? But in reality, this is all happening in a really chaotic environment. So we're squeezing into a cell, and this is what it looks like in reality. So your cell is incredibly crowded. There's all these different proteins. They're all running into each other. Most of these interactions don't do anything. They're just running into each other, trying to find the other partner that they need to do whatever it is they do. And yet, all of our life functions still happen. So life is happening in like the midst of all of this chaos, which is crazy. And so I hope you can appreciate how we see the order, we see like the fullness, we see the design and purpose that goes into creation. And so now we're going to take a look at how that starts to disintegrate because of the fall. So looking at the two curses that we received again in Genesis chapter 3. So starting with the curse of Eve, right? And pain will bring forth children. So this supposes that had Eve born children in the Garden of Eden, it would have been painless. So this gives us an indication that as a result of the fall, something has happened to our bodies. Our bodies are not functioning completely the way they're supposed to. Something has changed. And then Adam gives us even more detail because God says very explicitly, "Cursed is the ground because of you," right? "Thorns and thistles it shall bear for you." So not only have we been changed, so there's disintegration in our bodies, something has gone wrong, something is not completely right, but the very world around us is also being affected by the fall. So all the rest of the world has changed. And then it also says, "By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread," which again supposes that the commission that God gave us in the beginning was meant to be pleasant and fruitful, and it wasn't supposed to cause us a great deal of toil. And now that's different. We're still given the same commission, but now we're being told it's going to be challenging. The world will not bear fruit for us easily. And then, of course, the final consequence, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Because the wages of sin is death. So that's the ultimate effect of sin, is that death comes to us and it comes to like everything else in the created world. Okay, so when we look at the fall, looking at our four themes from earlier, instead of order, we get disorder, disintegration. Instead of abundance, we get loss, we get emptying. Instead of detail and design, we get again disintegration, a return to chaos, if you will. And then we still have our purpose, but that purpose is fraught with challenges. And so now we have to push against a world that's no longer going to be easily subdued by us. Okay. And so again, as a biologist, as a biochemist, I look at the small world. So I look at how changes in this part of our kind of levels of organization, so from atoms through macromolecules. So macromolecules, again, DNA, RNA, protein, how changes in those things cause disease in all these higher levels of organization. So the simplest way that we can think about that is by a disruption in our central dogma that we talked about before. So you have some kind of change in your DNA, which causes a change in your RNA, which causes a change in your protein. And again, since your proteins are the primary molecules that do all the stuff in your body, when you change a protein, you can dramatically change how everything works. And so to give you a simple example, I'm going to actually tell you about sickle cell anemia. So this is a disease most of you are probably at least vaguely familiar with. So this is a disease where instead of having nice, beautiful, round red blood cells, so your red blood cells, remember, are the cells that travel through your bloodstream, they carry oxygen. It's how oxygen gets to your body from your lungs, right? So they're very important. So rather than having these nice, healthy, round red blood cells, you get these sickle-shaped red blood cells, which, as you can imagine, they don't carry oxygen as well, so that's how you get anemic, is that your red blood cells literally can't carry as much oxygen. And then it also has a consequence that these red blood cells are very sticky, and they can stick together and cause blood clotting, can be very dangerous, as well as other medical symptoms that I don't know about because I'm not a medical doctor. But so sickle cell anemia is caused by a change in a protein called hemoglobin beta, which is part of this hemoglobin protein. Hemoglobin is the protein in your red blood cells that actually holds on to the oxygen. They're the reason why your blood is red, basically. That's how much hemoglobin you have in your bodies. And so a simple change in this one protein causes this downstream effect. So let's look a little bit more closely at what that is. So here I have two protein structures of regular hemoglobin and sickle cell hemoglobin that scientists have put together. So ignoring the colors, because the colors are just to help you know one from another. Does anyone really see a big difference between these two? Not really, right? Like the overall fold is the same. They look pretty much the same. It's hard to understand from this how you would end up with like a disease that literally morphs your red blood cells and has all of these other implications, right? So to understand this, we have to really get down deep into what's going on in this protein. So what's going on is that, again, at that beads on a string level, one of the beads got changed. So rather than being an amino acid called glutamate, which is up here, which has these two oxygens, it gets turned into an amino acid called valine, which doesn't have those two oxygens, right? And so that you can see when we zoom in to those structures I showed you before, you can see where the change happens. So we have, again, two reds, matches the red over there in the box, right? And then they're gone in this one. So that's the change. And if you look, that literally means that 6 atoms have changed. 6. And this molecule probably has tens of thousands of atoms. And changing 6 of them is enough to cause sickle cell anemia. Like that's how much detail went into the design of who we are and also how simple it is to disrupt it. If all diseases were this simple, I think we'd have a lot more cures for a lot more things. But unfortunately, there's multiple levels of complexity to what human diseases can look like. So, for instance, the disease that I studied in my PhD is a cardiomyopathy disorder. So basically, this means that the electrical signal, so your body has, in your heart, an electrical signal that basically propagates through your heart tissue that tells the muscles in your heart to contract and expand. That's how your heart beats in like a synchronized regular pattern, basically speaking. So in the cardiac arrhythmias, like what I studied, you get alterations in that electrical signal, which makes all the muscles in your heart get out of sync. And then when your heart is no longer beating as one synchronized unit, you can get cardiac arrest.
She's not going to tell you this, but she was the first author on this paper that's cited here. Brewer's her maiden name, just because she wouldn't tell you that.
No,
but she was the first author.
I wasn't going to tell you that. But so this can cause sudden cardiac arrest, which if you don't happen to have a defibrillator handy, can be fatal. And so it's really important to be able to identify people who have this disorder so that they can get preventative care to keep this from happening. Now, unlike our sickle cell anemia example, where you have one change in one protein that's very identifiable, in this particular case, we have one gene. I mean, you really have more than one, but for our cases, we're going to talk about one gene. But you can have a mutation basically anywhere inside this protein. So this is, again, an experimental structure of what this protein looks like. Every single one of these spheres is a place that an amino acid can get changed. So again, we're changing the bead on the string. And it can happen anywhere on this protein, and you can get this disease. And this is also really complicated because changing a bead here will cause the protein to behave differently than changing a bead here. So not only you get the same disease, but you can get it for different reasons. And then there are ways that you can treat it might also be different because you have changed a bead on a different part of the string. So we're starting to get more complex and it's starting to get more challenging. And then it can become even further complicated in situations like diabetes, which I'm not really going to explain that much of. We all have kind of a basic idea of what diabetes is. It affects about 1 in 10 people. It's a blood sugar regulation disorder that has all of these other side effects and symptoms attached to it. And so diabetes is not just caused by changes in our genes. Scientists have been trying for literal decades to figure out what genes might be considered causative of diabetes, and we don't have an answer. We can invest, call them risk factors, so you might be more likely to develop diabetes if you have certain changes in your DNA. But the way we understand diabetes now is that it's a relationship between your genetics and your environment. So the fall can not only cause disease because of changes in us, but again, because there are changes in our environment and our relationship to it, that can also be a way that we develop disease. So it gets more and more complex the farther along you go. And there's all kinds of different ways that that can manifest. And so now we're going to look into Christ's redeeming mission. So we can understand the beauty of creation, we can understand how it's been disintegrated by the fall, but then how does Christ work into this? So first, one thing that I find very interesting is that when God speaks in the Old Testament about his promise of redemption, he often uses language of physical healing. So that seems to be, part of the message that he's giving us. So looking at Isaiah 35, like the crocus, it will bloom abundantly. So the wilderness and the parched land being like Israel, right? So life being brought back from a wasteland or a wilderness. The eyes of the blind will see, ears of the deaf be opened, lame shall leap, mute tongues will sing for joy, right? So again, we have this language of physical healing that's being used as a representation of God redeeming his relationship with Israel. And Jesus fulfills that promise, right? I picked some pretty random examples out of the Gospels because you can turn open any page and Jesus is healing somebody, right? So for instance, in Matthew 4, they brought to him all who were sick and he cured them. This is one of my favorites. They laid the sick in the marketplace and begged him that they might touch the tassel of his cloak. And as many as touched it were healed. So imagine people are literally lining the streets with their sick, so that as Jesus walks through the marketplace, his tassels will touch them and they'll be healed. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to it in a second. And then Jesus gives us indications of what this physical healing is for, right? He says that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. This is where we have the paralytic coming down on a stretcher, right? They break into Peter's roof that he has to fix later, and they bring him down, and he gets healed, right? And he starts to give us indications here of what this is for. So there's a greater purpose behind what these physical healings are. And then this is my favorite example of this relationship between physical and spiritual healing. In John chapter 9, I encourage you to go read the whole thing. I can't talk about it all here, even though I want to. But so there's a man who's born blind who is begging at the gates of the city. Jesus' disciples ask him who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's born blind, because there's this idea that physical deformity is an indication of a spiritual deformity. That's a common misconception at this point in history. And Jesus answered, neither he nor his parents sinned, and so that the works of God might be made visible through him. And so then Jesus puts clay on his eyes, he goes and washes, and he's able to see. And then a whole bunch of other stuff happens that I'm not going to talk about. It's beautiful, and there's a lot to think about there. But later, Jesus finds him, after he's been able to see, and he said to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered and said, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, you have seen him. So again, this is important because Jesus is like the first person. Actually, no, he hasn't seen him because he has to go away to wash. So he doesn't know that the person that he's seeing is the one who healed him. So he's really encountering him for the first time in the light of his healing, right? He says, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. He says, I do believe, Lord, and he worshipped him. So from the physical healing this man receives, he receives the deeper healing of faith and is able to recognize the Lord, who he had never seen before this moment. And he actually worships him, which is a big deal because Jesus hasn't even died yet. So this is a tremendous act of faith that he's worshiping this man that he has just met. But that's what this physical healing is meant to manifest, is this deeper healing and relationship with God. And Jesus explicitly calls us to share in this mission of healing. So while Jesus is alive and doing his initial ministry work, he summons his 12 apostles and gives them authority to cure diseases. And they go, proclaim the good news, and they cure diseases. So there's a hand in hand of both these things. Even, again, before Jesus dies and fulfills that mission that he came for. And then, so on the evening of that first day of the week, so now this is the day of the resurrection. So Jesus is just risen from the dead. He again commissions his disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. So he's explicitly handing on to us the mission that he began. And then we can see in Acts of the Apostles, so this is after Jesus has ascended into heaven. This is after Pentecost gives them the fullness of the gift of the Holy Spirit, right? What we would call in confirmation, that's what we receive. And they're fully invested in their mission now. And so now we see they carried the sick out into the streets, laid them on cots and mats, that when Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on one or another of them. So remember earlier when I talked about them laying the sick out in the marketplace for Jesus, they're doing the same thing for Peter now. And they don't even need him to touch them. That his shadow might fall on them and they would be healed. Right? So when Jesus says, you will do even greater things than I, like this is the kind of thing he's talking about. And he's actually able to cure all of them. So we're called to share in this redeeming mission of Christ in like every sense. Okay, and so now we'll look at again how science is part of this redeeming mission. So I can kind of think about this in two different ways. So the first is looking at basic science, which is understanding the body. So looking at the organization of our bodies and thinking, how is it supposed to work? And basic science sometimes gets a little bit of a bad rap in the sense that people might say, like, well, why don't you just study the disease? Why does it matter how it's supposed to work? Why not just look at what's not working? But I tend to think about it in the same way that John Paul II thought about theology of the body. So Pope St. John Paul II wrote this beautiful work called Theology of the Body. It's a series of general audiences he gave in the late 1970s. I'm not sure how far along they stretched, but I think it was into the 1980s. And it's talking all about marriage and the family. So lining up a really deep theology of how we understand man and woman, how we understand marriage, how we understand sexual ethics and like legislation of like what we are and are not supposed to do, what we ought and ought not do. And the way that he frames this entire conversation is he goes back to a really pivotal moment in the Gospel of Matthew. So essentially Jesus is being asked by some elders, I can't remember, I think it might be the Pharisees who are asking him, but I don't remember. They basically ask him, is it permissible to divorce? Like, well, Moses said we could get divorced. Is it permissible to divorce? And rather than just answering their question, Jesus makes an appeal to the beginning. So he tells them, have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them man and female? And said, for this reason, the man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, right? Therefore, what God has joined together, no man must separate. So Jesus makes an appeal to our original creation, our original design, in answering this question about how we ought to be now. And basic science is really doing a similar thing. By understanding like how something was originally designed to be, to the best that we can understand it now, we can have a deeper understanding of what to do in this disintegrated world that we live in. And this is the kind of I do basic science, that's really what I do. So I'll give you again a big overview of my science. We're not going to go through all of this, but basically I'm trying to understand how proteins in our bodies get where they're supposed to go. So when you think about like proteins like hormones that travel through your body, they're basically the way that your body communicates with itself. Those get made inside the cell, but then they have to get out of the cell into your bloodstream to travel around and communicate with other cells. And so I study very broadly how they get there. So these cells are made in an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum. Again, there's not a quiz, don't worry about it. And then they have to go through this long journey to make it out of the cell. And so I'm studying this, broadly speaking, but again, because I go small, we're going to go smaller. I don't study the whole thing, I study this part. I study this little bit, how the proteins get out of the endoplasmic reticulum. So there's this whole big long pathway, and I'm studying that bit. And I'm not even just studying that part. We're getting even smaller now. So I study, basically, so you can think about these proteins that I'm showing here. These are like your postal carriers. They're the ones that are showing up to the FedEx warehouse, and they have to scan all the packages and decide which packages leave, which packages stay, and what truck do they need to go on to get where they need to go. So I'm trying to understand the relationship between the postal carrier and the proteins that are the packages. So I'm looking essentially at what's their barcode. How do these postal carriers scan the packages and figure out where they need to go? So that's like, again, we're getting smaller and smaller. This is how small basic science can get. And that's the science that I do. And then we can also think science in the more traditional way that you might think about it being part of Christ's redemption, which is translational science. So taking what we understand from this basic science, understanding of what's going on in a disease in like model systems, and then thinking how do we translate that into an actual treatment for a human patient. Okay, and this is where I give my shameless plug for St. Jude, because I think they're an example par excellence of doing this exact kind of work. So St. Jude was founded by Danny Thomas in 1962. So the story is, and this is from the St. Jude website directly, that he prayed to St. Jude because he was an actor who was out of work and trying to figure out what to do, and he told St. Jude, "Show me my way in life and I will build you a shrine." And shortly afterwards he made his big success as an actor. And then St. Jude became his shrine. And so that's the kind of how the hospital was founded back in 1962. And since then, St. Jude has been really focusing on pediatric cancer and all kinds of pediatric diseases now. And luckily, in part because of the work that St. Jude has done, pediatric cancer survival has risen from 20% in 1962, so that when St. Jude was founded, to more than 80% today. And for some, it's as high as like 95% survival for some diseases. So it's a really incredible way that we can use our gifts as scientists to give something, give that healing to the community. So I'll end with just a couple of other things that St. Jude is doing that I think is interesting. So of course we have our clinical trials. We're currently recruiting for 158 clinical trials right now, as of Tuesday, when we put this together. We also have, to bring us back to sickle cell, collaborative research consortium for sickle cell disease, so finding treatments that are more effective for sickle cell disease. And then we have this genomic medicine initiative, which is a precision medicine initiative basically for patients who, and I'm really oversimplifying this, but they might be like the only patient that has this mutation. And traditional, pharmaceutical companies aren't going to design a drug for one person. So that's where this kind of initiative really comes into play, is looking at the individual patient and saying, how can we help this one child? And I think that's really beautiful. And so that's all I